Well, welcome back to another episode of Global Insights for Tax Leadership, which I hope is serving as your go-to video series for relevant topics impacting the tax profession. And whether you're a seasoned tax professional or simply somebody looking to better understand the complexities of the tax world, this is absolutely the series designed with you in mind. So now we're on to our fourth episode, which is going to cover a topic that many in the tax community have likely heard about. And quite frankly, I assume those outside of the tax community have heard about, and that's tariffs. If you're enjoying the series or you're new to the series, make sure to give it a like or comment on LinkedIn and YouTube. So by way of background, again, I'm Jeff Burns. I'm a lead tax partner in KPMG's business tax services practice. And with me today, I have Chris Young, a principal in KPMG's trade and customs practice. He's based in Chicago as well with me. Chris, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff.
So the first place I want to start is if you could give just a very basic background on a core question. What is a tariff?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, a tariff is essentially a tax, right? It's a tax that is levied on the import, a product that is imported, moves across a border into the United States. It's levied at the time of import, so when that product crosses and has to be declared to customs. So as a tax professional, I'm sure you understand a tax return. Effectively, that's what you do when you make a customs declaration. You make a tax return, and that's when you pay a tariff. It's a percentage. It's based on a value. There's sort of three fundamental things that go into how much a tariff will be, and obviously it's the percentage itself, but it's the value on which that percentage is charged. The tariff code, the product, what is the product, and then where is the product coming from, the country of origin. So those are sort of the three main things that go into what the tariff actually is and how much you'll get charged.
That's perfect. I think that's a great background on kind of the core concept of a tariff. So with that, and this is a very broad question, but can you maybe dive just a little bit deeper into the current environment of tariffs from a U.S. lens? So, what exists today? What are some of the proposals looking like? And I recognize that's a big question, but I wanted to get some of your perspective on that.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly complicated to explain, but I'll do my best. I mean, I think, what you have to sort of recognize is, coming into the second Trump administration, there were already quite a lot of tariffs around. Okay. So, what you've heard about in the last few months, that sort of sits on top of what was already there. There were already some tariffs on China. There's already some tariffs on steel and aluminium products. And also we already have customs duties, things that you already would pay tariffs on, the normal customs duties, I often call them. And so on top of that, what we've had in the last 6 months is sort of an evolution, lots of new tariffs, new rules, which I think sort of represent sort of how tariffs are being used by the government at the moment as sort of a tool, right? A geopolitical, economic tool, right? So, but it really boils down to kind of like two basic forms of tariffs, right? Those that are now being levied on certain products or certain sectors, certain industries, and then those that are levied on certain countries, right? So I think, starting off with sort of the products, I mean, we've got tariffs right now on the steel and aluminium sectors, right? So, 50% on that. It's not just steel and aluminium products, but also some of their derivatives, things that contain those metals as well. Other industries that are affected is auto industry, right? So cars are levied with 25% and car parts with 25% as well. And that's a variety of different things that contribute to the vehicle. And so, those are largely what's in force at the moment in terms of the industries, but then there's a whole host of different products that could potentially be targeted and certainly are being targeted by the government. So just this week, there was an announcement of a 50% tariff on copper. So we'll see how that gets implemented. But also pharmaceuticals were mentioned this week too, but there's, active investigations related to pharma, to copper, to critical minerals, and to other industries as well. So it's really all sort of a lot of focus on products. And then just to mention, right, those tariffs are implemented really under the sort of the national security provisions that the president has at his disposal to use to implement these tariffs. So that's really the essence of what these are. The threat to the national security of the nation related to these industries. We need to protect these industries. And I mention that because it relates to my next point, which is the one about the countries, right? So, what we've got, the tariffs on the countries themselves. So that really started with, China, Mexico, and Canada earlier this year. And those were implemented under an emergency provision that is available to the president. So the emergency around that was related to fentanyl and immigration. So we normally call those the sort of the fentanyl tariffs. So 25% on Canada and Mexico, 20% on China related to that. And then what we have in addition to that is a slightly different emergency, but the what we call tariffs related to called reciprocal tariffs. So related to the trade deficit, the emergency related to that. And so what that's sort of a little bit back and forth on that, but ultimately what we have today is a 10% tariff on all countries. 10% on all countries, but except for Canada and Mexico, right? So the Chinese negotiated down to 10% from a much higher rate. The UK even has negotiated their potential rate, have kept it at 10% with some other provisions. And so obviously what we're looking for now is what will happen next with these rates. So they have been suspended. Higher rates over 10% have been suspended, but we're expecting those to go back into force on August 1st, which is a recent announcement this week by the president. And so, what will happen with those, obviously, we're still waiting to see. But August 1st is now the date that higher rates will go into force on particular countries. And then I'll just sort of, on the country-specific rates, just mention there is a court case sort of working through the court system that challenges those emergency tariffs. So we're really waiting to see the results of that and how that affects whether these tariffs will stay in force or not. But while that is working through the system, these tariffs are in force.
So that's quite a bit of information on tariffs, and I think I do appreciate you breaking that down between a very much product focus versus a country focus. And I think with that as the background, and we talk with folks in the tax community, I do see that there is a bit of conversation in tax, but we also see a lot of conversation in supply chain and how companies are reacting or should react to this if they can. And can you maybe talk just a little bit about some of the key areas that companies should be focused on in light of the imposition of tariffs and the executive orders that we're seeing?
Certainly, yeah. I think companies are obviously focused on this sort of the initial shock. I think has sort of dissipated. We now know tariffs are here, and I personally think they're here to stay. I think you look at sort of everything that I just talked about. There was some research done earlier. I think I saw it this week, but sort of noticed that there was at least every 3 to 5 days some kind of tariff change in tariff policy, right? So it's happening very quickly, and I don't think that's going to stop. So what do you do, right? I think it's very hard when you're a company looking to make the bigger decisions, I would say, when there's that much uncertainty and especially with things like the court case that I mentioned. So I think it's very challenging to sort of go and change entire supply chains, move production to, whole shift of production to different countries. I think that's a difficult thing, a difficult decision to take in the current environment. Again, it depends on the products you're talking about and which industry and perhaps. But I think what companies are starting to do is certainly sort of that supply chain resilience thing. Maybe there are different sources that you can look to that might sort of help you hedge against new changes and things. But I think what I'm seeing a lot of companies do, is sort of some of the simpler measures out there than changing your entire supply chain, right? So looking at what I would just broadly call tariff mitigation, right? So legitimate measures that you can take to reduce the impact, right? Maybe you've not had to look at it before. Maybe you've not, as a company, really had a high customs duty or tariff bill. It's sort of the same thing. You've not really had to worry about it. And maybe your trade program, your import and export program is not really set up to look for all the opportunities that are out there. So, whether it's looking at, how your transfer prices are set, whether that's looking at any sort of how you arrive at that customs valuation, right? Legitimate ways that we can reduce that, right? There's lots of ideas that you could use. Other things around, making sure that you've got the right information to hand to make that declaration that I mentioned earlier in our conversation. So the country of origin being the big one, right? Making sure that you've got that right, what that data is and what the answer is. And then there's lots of other things that are, specifically provided for in law, right? So there's provisions allowing you to deduct US content out of the value, right? There's provisions that allowing you to declare under a prototype provision or under an agricultural use provision. It really does depend on your scenario, but there's lots of things that you can do, lots of levers that you can pull, even if it's not that big supply chain shift. There's lots of things that you can look at. It's really just that awareness, knowing about them, and then obviously really implementing them in the right way so that you're doing it right and you're compliant moving forwards.
No, that's helpful. And, it sounds to me there's a bit of a model aspect to it, and then certainly a cross-functional integration between tax and supply chain to really understand the impact and think about how you solve for that impact in an organization. I think the last question I have for you is really, well, what are kind of the important areas you want to leave anyone listening to this and watching this with, and where should they focus today?
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough question, but I mean, my personal thoughts, right, is I think you're really trying to make sure you understand your understanding that the framework within which these tariffs are being levied, right? So the general direction of the government, right, is clearly, I think, to use tariffs as a lever, right, for different types of, whether it's foreign policy or commercial policy, economic policy, whatever you want to call it, they're going to be used. And so I think understanding that. So first things first, continue to monitor those changes, right? You've got to keep an eye on what's going on. It's very easy to get overwhelmed by the changes and everything. So, but really trying to drill down on, where your sources of information are for all the changes. Keep monitoring. I would then say, you mentioned it yourself, actually, the modeling aspect, right? So understanding what those changes mean for you and being able to do that very, very quickly, right? So using modeling tools, KPMG has one, feeding your data in, understanding the different scenarios, whether it's today's rules or what you think might happen next week or even in a year's time, using those modeling tools to kind of understand how you're going to be impacted. And obviously that helps you only so far. You then need to be able to enact changes related to what you see, right, related to those impacts. So I think that would be the big thing for me, is really looking at how you organize around trade, right? How do you manage the process? Where is your data coming from? So, what I would call the target operating model of your enterprise, right, related to trade. What people do you need? What processes do you need to implement? What new technologies do you need? Because, as I say, this is not going away. You need to build resilient capabilities around this, and really invest in what you already have to make sure that you can handle this on an ongoing basis.
Now that's perfect, Chris, and I do want to thank you again for your time. It's a complex issue and one that the information continues to flow and change. So appreciate you spending the time with me today to talk through it and for our audience to hear it.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Well, again, thank you, and look for our next video series and continue the appreciated support from the community. Thank you.